Mockery, direct threats, calls for dialogue and peace, and even a publicity stunt aimed at Donald Trump. The open letter from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin became one of the main events not only in Ukrainian but also in the global media space. Several Western media outlets published it in full, while others dedicated articles to it, trying to assess this move by the Ukrainian president. The Kremlin has already responded to this letter, and in Washington, American President Donald Trump stated that he welcomes any meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. And in this episode, we will discuss together how Zelensky's address was received in Moscow, in Washington, and in the world media. And most importantly, we will discuss: will this letter have any impact at all on ending the war, and why did Zelensky actually publish it? My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, leave any comment, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link is in the description of this video. So, very briefly, let me remind you that Volodymyr Zelensky published an open letter to Vladimir Putin on the website of the Office of the President of Ukraine, in which he stated that Ukraine is capable of sharply increasing the cost of the war for Russia, and called on Putin to hold a personal meeting to end the military actions. He even said, "Let's clearly set the time and place. We'll come and meet." You know, it seems to me that Zelensky tried to speak in the language of the St. Petersburg street toughs, which is where Putin himself comes from, and said, "Clearly, let's set up a meeting. Time and place. We meet and make a deal, or will you back out again?" At the moment when this document appeared on the official website of the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Putin was speaking with journalists at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and commented on Kyiv's strikes on St. Petersburg and Moscow's use of Oreshnik missiles. In his open letter, Zelensky states that the war brings more and more negativity to Russia. He notes that Russian citizens dislike Ukrainian drones and missiles, the gasoline shortage, constant restrictions, and the intention to organize a new mobilization. And in the end, Zelensky openly called on Putin to take care of his own safety, since Ukrainian drones could reach him personally. Well, in general, I presented the full text of Volodymyr Zelensky's open letter and an analysis of this address yesterday in a separate episode on this YouTube channel. Be sure to check it out. And today, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin was informed about the open letter from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. This was reported by the press service, Kremlin Secretary Dmitry Peskov, and Peskov added that Russia has no official channels of communication with Ukraine. Peskov refused to disclose any other details, in particular Vladimir Putin's reaction to this letter. Separately, Peskov stated that the Kremlin allegedly hopes for the resumption of the negotiation process to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. It sounds very strange here. They're telling you directly, let's negotiate, specify the time and place clearly. Peskov starts to dodge and says, well, we hope the negotiations will resume, blah. At the same time, he didn't specify what format of negotiations Russia actually supports. Also, Putin's press secretary stated that the White House's position on Ukraine is both consistent and contradictory at the same time. Basically, he decided to switch to another topic. Next is his quote. It is consistent in terms of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently stated, who said, well, overall, of course, we only support one side, that's Ukraine, and we supply weapons there and so on. So, this is happening consistently. In other words, this really is a war that was Biden's war. Actually, Biden is involved indirectly. There are no plans for a meeting between Putin and President Donald Trump in the near future. Well, basically, as you understood, Putin's team decided to stay silent and not really respond to Zelensky's letter, except for repeating the mantra that Zelensky can come to Moscow. US President Donald Trump has also already weighed in on Zelensky's letter. Trump specifically backed a personal meeting between the two countries' leaders and said discussing this possibility makes him very happy. It would be wonderful if Zelensky and Putin met for negotiations. I believe they are both very good people. Well, after that, Trump, broke down and started repeating again that without American aid, which for some reason he credited to himself, Ukraine would not have been able to hold out until now. Well, in the end, the US president stated, I expect mutual compromises from Ukraine and Russia to resolve the conflict, and he said that if this happens, it will be his personal achievement. Here's the quote: "I was the one who proposed these concessions, and we put a lot of effort into this. I want each side to make certain concessions, and I think they will do it." At the same time, the open letter from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin became one of the main events, not only in the Ukrainian, but also in the global media space. Well, let me give you a few examples. For example, the American agency Assassinated Press stated that the letter contains extensive criticism of all 26 years of Vladimir Putin's rule and points to the fragile position of the Russian dictator. According to the journalists of the publication, Zelensky is obviously trying to take advantage of the current advantage of the armed forces of Ukraine at the front to launch a real diplomatic process. The New York Times published an article titled "Zelensky in a Letter to Putin Combines Mockery and Offers of Peace Talks." And the authors of the publication note that Putin was pointed to military failures, inflation, and Russia's dependence on China. At the same time, the journalists suggest that the second, less obvious recipient of the letter was Donald Trump, since the text contains a veiled reproach to the US president, because of his separate negotiations with Putin in Alaska last year. Journalists from the British public broadcaster BBC believe that the tone of the letter was bold, even mocking, as it directly drew attention to the recent strikes on Russian territory. The French newspaper Le Monde described Zelensky's letter as an attempt to bring Russia back to the table. Meanwhile, the German weekly Die Zeit writes that Zelensky's letter has a threatening undertone in some places. Well, I'll focus more on the reaction of the New York Times. It caught my attention the most. The publication writes that Zelensky's letter to Vladimir Putin looks partly like a PR move and apparently was aimed at getting Donald Trump's attention. In particular, the document contains an initiative to resume dialogue. However, at the same time, it points to Moscow's military failures, inflation, Russia's dependence on China, mentions Vladimir Putin's age, criticizes Vladimir Putin, and so on. As the New York Times writes, if Ukraine wants dialogue, it supposedly should not have spoken that way about the bald, stinky dwarf Vladimir Putin. Sorry, here's the quote. At the same time, it's unclear whether this statement was an attempt to start negotiations or a way to discredit a potential negotiating partner. The letter appeared, at least in part, to be an informational move, highlighting Ukraine's long-range strikes on St. Petersburg, which had both economic and psychological effects. It is unclear what exactly Zelensky could gain from this combination of pressure and an offer of peace. In general, friends, I'll leave it at that for now. Please write in the comments, what do you think? Why did Zelensky write this open letter to Vladimir Putin? What was he trying to say with this letter? And what will be the consequences of this letter, if there are any at all? Subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and don't forget to hit the bell. Also, if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video or by scanning the QR code on your screen. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.